For this last video, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the experiences I had implementing a flipped classroom that were challenges or obstacles I faced. There are a lot of concerns that I think can come to bear when we start thinking about flipping our classroom. A lot of the concerns that I had initially generally turned out not to be that big a deal, but there's a handful of things that I think are important to think about and a few proactive things that we can do as instructors to minimize some of the greatest long-term obstacles we might face when doing this kind of project. I think at its core, we have to make sure that our students understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. I've found that if the students buy in to what we're trying to do, that it goes smoothly. And one of the things that I have started to do is the very first day of class, before we do the syllabus, before we do anything about the course, I initiate a conversation with my students about what they think a classroom is, what they think the responsibilities of the instructor and the students are, what they have typically been, what they should be, and what learning looks like outside of the classroom. We have a conversation where many students have had these sort of stage on a stage lecture style courses. Many students will talk about how the responsibility of the teacher is to teach us the material and make it interesting. The responsibility of the student is to do the homework and take the test, right? A very traditional model, right? And I think to do this in a conversational setting where you begin to prod and push them into this idea. You ask by when should they first engage with the coursework, right? We're familiar with this. We ask our students to read the textbook chapter before they come to class. Well, they're not going to do it. We talk about why that's difficult, but what the benefits are, and really have a conversation leading them to understanding the motivation for the flipped classroom, right? Why we're doing it, what the point is, what good learning looks like. I ask them to remember things from prior courses. Right? What are those things that they have carried over? And most of the time, they're citing examples of active learning, of meaningful learning, and you can sort of integrate that and show that's where real learning and mastery comes from, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think getting students to understand what we're trying to do and what it's going to look like philosophically at the very beginning is useful to getting that buy-in. The students also have to understand the mechanics of the flipped classroom, the expectations of it, right? That really needs to be clearly stated. And this gets into, I think, one of the biggest fears I hear when I talk to other instructors about this, and one of the biggest fears I had, and one of the turned out to be fairly legitimate challenge that I face, which is how do we get the students to engage with the pre-course work? Right? That buy-in from the very beginning is important, right? But I think we have to implement monitoring and accountability. Right? One of the most useful things that I found to make sure that students engage with the coursework, we're going to cover some in the workshop, but it's also in the reading, is what Tauber calls these guided practices, right? Where you're not just tossing out a video or a chapter and asking them to read or watch something, but you're giving them something to work on, right? That helps guide them to what they're supposed to be learning. That helps them try to understand if they're catching on to the key points. It's pedagogically useful, but those guided exercises are also a mechanism for you to see who has watched the videos and who has attempted to do the work, right? So have those in place, both to help the students do the pre-course work, but also as a means to monitor who is doing it. And you should make sure that they are due before class, and you should review them before class so you know which students have done it and which students have not done it, and what are those areas where students are struggling with, if there are any, that you can start with. I always do a start of day quiz where I re-ask material for the pre-course work, have students go over at the start of class. And we monitor, right? And those students who aren't engaging, who aren't doing the work, we check in with them just like we would any other time that they weren't completing coursework. Another element that I think can be very strong is the accountability inside the classroom. If you implement group activities or you implement opportunities for you to work one-on-one with the students, and you set the expectation that they should know the material ahead of time. When they start working in groups, when they start working with you and they haven't done it, it's uncomfortable for them, right? And students very quickly grasp the idea that this pre-course work is important. They have to do it, right? You have to remember where a lot of students are coming from, which is read the chapter before you come to class, is what they were familiar with pre-course work. And most of the time they didn't have to do it. We were going to cover the material in the lecture anyway, and it really didn't matter when they read the chapter. But if you make it so that the classroom experience is diminished or even uncomfortable for them in those group work situations or in those individual work situations, they're going to grasp very quickly that this is part of the course and they're going to fall into it. Right? And I found that after a few weeks, most of my students are engaged with material pre-course work, and those students who aren't, I continue to work with them as best I can. And at some point, there are going to be those students who aren't going to do the work, and that's going to be true whether it's a flipped classroom or a traditional classroom. And you do the best you can to reach them, but you focus on those students that are going to have success in the class. Another major challenge and major concern is the time investment. Flipping a classroom, I'm not going to lie to you, is a lot of work. Right? I think it's similar to what a lot of us experienced when we had to convert our classes online. Right? Creating that material, creating the learning objectives, creating the in-class activities, the guided practices, all of this stuff is work. But a lot of that work can be repeated across terms. And just like when we set up our online classes, it takes a ton of work up front, but once it's there, it moves smoothly. And then the next semester, we just have to, change a few things here and there, keep things updated, fix things that didn't quite work. But what you'll find is once that initial work has been put in, I think my flipped classes actually now take the least amount of work to prepare before the start of a semester. Because a lot of the heavy lifting has been done, it's implemented, I just have to tweak a few things, and then I'm ready to go, right? And once that's in place, right, you gain dividends. I think you will ultimately gain more time implementing it by putting that work in early, and it's just you gain time in the semester too, right? The classroom is easier to run, the content is easier to cover, so the time will come, right? It does require that investment, but you will gain back more time than you lose in that investment. One way I think to help overcome this is not to try to just flip a class completely. And you can if you want, but I think you can start by just flipping a single lesson or flipping a single unit, right? And see how it goes. Right? And then every semester, flip a couple more lessons or another unit, right? And over the course of, a year or, 2 or 3 semesters, you might have your whole class eventually flipped. Right? But students are adaptable, courses are adaptable, right? Take those concepts, take a topic that your students are really going to struggle with, one that you know is difficult, and try flipping it, right? And see how that goes. And then if you like it and it's successful, flip another, right? And you can do this incrementally, right? A flipped classroom can fit perfectly fine in any other sort of model, of your course design. So it doesn't have to be done all at once.